It was a day like any other. But for one little black girl, it would be a moment she would never forget. Standing in a crowded room, her small voice rose above the murmurs as she asked a simple yet powerful question to one of the most controversial figures in modern politics, Donald Trump. No one could have predicted what would happen next. As the former president responded, the room fell silent. And within moments, tears welled up in her eyes. What did he say that moved her so deeply? The answer would shock everyone who witnessed it. The room, once buzzing with conversation, grew eerily quiet as all eyes turned toward the little girl. She stood with a mix of courage and innocence. Her wide brown eyes locked onto Trump, waiting for his answer. Journalists gripped their pens. Cameras zoomed in. And the world seemed to pause in anticipation.
Trump, seated comfortably in his chair, adjusted his tie and let out a small chuckle. "Well, that's an interesting question," he began, his voice carrying the familiar confidence that had both captivated and divided millions. The little girl shifted slightly on her feet, her hands clasped together, hoping for an answer that would make sense to her young heart.
For a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Trump's face, almost as if he understood the weight of the moment. Then, he leaned forward and spoke. What he said next sent a ripple through the audience. Some gasped. Others exchanged knowing glances. And the little girl, she stood frozen, her expression shifting as the words sank in. Tears welled up in her eyes, her tiny hands tightening into fists at her sides. Whether they were tears of sadness, frustration, or something deeper, no one could tell. But in that instant, the world saw more than just a child's reaction, they saw a reflection of a much larger truth. And then, the murmurs returned. A journalist raised a hand, ready to ask a follow-up question. The little girl blinked rapidly, trying to process what she had just heard. And Trump? He leaned back, seemingly satisfied with his response. But the moment was far from over. What would she say next? Would she challenge him? Would she walk away? Or would someone else in the room speak up before she could? The air was thick with tension, and everyone was waiting for what would happen next. The little girl wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to hold back the tears. But they came anyway, rolling down her cheeks. Her shoulders trembled slightly as she took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to speak. The room was silent, almost holding its breath in sympathy, waiting for her to say something, anything. She looked down at her shoes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Her heart raced as she struggled to make sense of what she had just heard. She had expected an answer that would reassure her, one that would make her feel seen and heard. But instead, his words had left her questioning everything. A woman in the audience, perhaps a mother or an older sister, stood up, her voice gentle but firm. "It's okay, sweetie," she said, walking over to the girl and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to answer him. You're allowed to feel upset." The woman's words seemed to break the tension in the room. But the girl's tear-filled eyes were still locked on Trump. Her gaze was intense, searching for something in him, a hint of understanding, of empathy. Trump sat back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, looking slightly uncomfortable. The room was filled with a quiet anticipation. But it was clear he wasn't about to apologize or retract his words. Instead, he stared at the little girl, almost daring her to say something in response. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then, finally, the little girl spoke. her voice small but resolute. "Why do you say those things?" she asked, her words cutting through the heavy silence. "I don't understand. You're supposed to be the leader. And I thought leaders are supposed to help us, not hurt us." Her question echoed in the room. And for a moment, even Trump seemed taken aback. The weight of her words lingered in the air, leaving everyone in the room to reflect on the broader implications of his answer, and how it had affected this one small, brave soul. As the room waited for his response, the girl wiped her eyes again. But this time, there was a glimmer of determination in her expression. She may have been young, but her question had the power to challenge the very foundation of everything she had been taught about leadership, compassion, and justice. She had asked the question that so many others were afraid to ask, and now it was time to see how the world would respond. And just when everyone thought they knew how the story would end, the door to change creaked open, revealing a new chapter, one that no one could have predicted. Trump blinked, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge from a young child. For a split second, he seemed uncertain. But it was fleeting. A slight smirk crept onto his face, and he shifted in his seat as if trying to regain control of the situation. "Well," he began, his tone a little defensive now, "I think you're just too young to understand what I meant."
The girl stood her ground, her little fists clenched in determination. "I'm not too young," she said, her voice firmer now. "I understand what you're saying. And it hurts. I just don't know why you would say something that makes people feel like they don't matter." Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and the room fell into an even deeper silence. The people around her exchanged uneasy glances, some unsure of how to react. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, some with expressions of disbelief, others with growing admiration for the courage this little girl was showing in the face of such a powerful figure.
Trump's expression shifted. No longer amused or confident, but something closer to unease. For a brief moment, he seemed at a loss for words. It was as if her innocence, her honesty, was something he hadn't anticipated. The girl took a deep breath, the tears still glistening in her eyes. But her voice was unwavering. "If you're a leader, you should make people feel strong, not weak. You should help people who are hurting, not hurt them more." And just like that, the world seemed to pause again. In that moment, the power dynamic had shifted. The little girl, with her simple yet profound words, had turned the tables. She wasn't the one looking to be comforted. She wasn't waiting for validation. She had just turned the lens back on him, on his leadership, his actions, and his words. It was a powerful silence that followed, broken only when the same woman who had comforted the girl earlier spoke up again, her voice clear and steady. "You've heard her, sir," the woman said, addressing Trump directly. "She's right. A leader's job is to lift people up, not tear them down." Trump shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between the woman, the girl, and the growing crowd. This wasn't the response he was used to. There was no applause. There was no rally of support. In fact, there was only a growing sense of unease, as if the world around him was starting to see the cracks in the walls of his confidence. But the little girl, despite the tears still tracing her cheeks, stood taller now. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't asking for comfort. She had already given the answer that needed to be heard. As the room remained silent, one final question lingered in the air: would Trump respond? Or would the moment slip away? leaving behind only the echo of the girl's words and the realization that sometimes true leadership begins with listening, not speaking. The world held its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The air in the room grew thicker as Trump's silence stretched on. He seemed to be grappling with something he hadn't expected, a challenge not from a rival politician, but from a child. His gaze flickered briefly over the crowd, searching for someone to help him navigate this unexpected moment. But no one spoke. No one moved. Everyone, it seemed, was holding their breath, waiting for him to answer. The little girl, her face still tear-streaked but now marked with quiet strength, didn't look away. She stood unwavering, her eyes fixed on Trump as if to say, "This is bigger than you or me. This is about the truth." Her words had already cut through the facade of power that he had built. And now, in the weight of that silence, the truth seemed to loom larger than ever. Trump shifted in his seat again. But this time, his movements were less confident. "You know," he began slowly, his voice lacking its usual conviction. Sometimes things are more complicated than they appear." The girl shook her head, her resolve growing stronger. "No," she replied softly, but with an undeniable firmness in her voice. "It's not complicated. It's about being kind. It's about helping people. It's about respect." The simplicity of her answer seemed to unsettle him. He had expected a more typical response, one of agreement, or perhaps a dismissal of her question. But this was different. The honesty in her words had cut through the noise of politics. And now, for the first time in a long while, he seemed to be facing a truth he hadn't prepared for. Around the room, the atmosphere shifted. The murmurs that had started to grow louder were no longer about politics or policy. They were whispers of admiration for the courage this child had shown. Some in the audience even wiped away tears of their own, moved by her clarity and bravery. It was clear that this moment, this simple exchange between a little girl and a man who had once been the most powerful in the world, was one that would not be forgotten. The woman who had comforted the girl earlier spoke up again, her voice now carrying an air of finality. "Sir, it's not about being right or wrong. It's about making things right. You have the power to make people feel heard. Not small. The power to unite. Not divide. That's what leadership is."
The room was silent again. But this time, the weight of her words seemed to settle on Trump's shoulders. The people around him were no longer waiting for him to prove something, they were waiting for him to acknowledge something. To acknowledge that leadership isn't about ego or authority, but about empathy, understanding, and lifting others up. For a long moment, there was no sound, save for the faint hum of the cameras still recording. The little girl's tear-streaked face was framed by the light, her small body standing tall in the face of giants. And in that moment, she wasn't just a child. She was a voice for everyone who had ever felt unheard, unseen, and forgotten.
And as the world watched, it was unclear who would speak next. But one thing was certain, the moment had shifted something deep within the hearts of those in that room. What came next? No one knew. But whatever it was clear that the path forward would never be the same again. The world held its breath.
The silence lingered, thick and expectant, as if time itself had slowed to witness what would happen next. Trump's gaze dropped to the table in front of him, his fingers tapping nervously, an expression crossing his face that hadn't been seen in years, uncertainty.
It was almost as though he was processing something deeper than he had before, a realization that his words, his actions, had consequences far beyond his own understanding. The little girl had pierced the shield he had so carefully constructed. And in doing so, she had made him face a part of himself he had long ignored. The room shifted slightly as a few people began to stand. And others, sensing the weight of the moment, remained seated in quiet contemplation. But the question on everyone's mind remained, what would Trump do now? The little girl, her arms at her sides and her shoulders back, didn't seem to notice the tension building in the room. She was simply waiting for him to either acknowledge her words or retreat into the comfortable distance that he had been accustomed to. And then, as the seconds stretched longer, something unexpected happened. Trump slowly looked up at her, his expression less defiant than before. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was something almost human in his eyes, an awareness of the gravity of the situation. "You know," he began again, this time softer, his voice less commanding. "You make a point. I didn't think of it like that." The room went silent again. But this time it was a different kind of silence. This wasn't the tense anticipation of waiting for a response. It was a collective breath held, as if everyone was wondering whether he would truly hear her, or if it was just another political move, a statement without meaning. But the little girl, undeterred by his wavering tone, stepped forward slightly. "It's not about thinking of it like that," she said, her voice clear and unshaken. "It's about doing something that makes things better. Not just for some, but for all of us." Her words hung in the air. And for the first time, there seemed to be no escape from them, not for him, not for anyone in the room. They were simple. Yes. But they were undeniable. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about power. It was about humanity. Trump's gaze softened as he looked at the little girl. The weight of the room's collective attention was palpable. And in that brief moment, the walls of his resistance seemed to crumble just a little. For once, he wasn't in control. For once, he wasn't the one directing the conversation. The simple truth of her words had shifted the power dynamic entirely. The woman from the audience, who had been a steady support for the girl, now spoke again, but with a new kind of hope in her voice. "Maybe it's time for all of us to think about what it means to lead with compassion," she said, addressing not only Trump but everyone in the room. And just like that, something inside the room began to change. People were starting to see the bigger picture, the possibility of a world where leadership wasn't just about authority or division, but about lifting people up and hearing their stories. Trump opened his mouth as if to speak, but then paused, as though the right words eluded him. His gaze met the little girl's again. And for the first time, there was no defensiveness, no bravado, only quiet reflection. I don't have all the answers," he said slowly, the words coming less easily than they ever had before. "But I'm listening." The moment hung there, suspended in the air. Was it enough? Was this the turning point? Before anyone could react, the little girl, wiping the last of her tears away, nodded with a gentle smile. "That's all we need," she said softly. "Just listen." The room exhaled, as if released from the weight of unspoken words. And for a brief moment, it felt as though the world had shifted just a little closer toward understanding. But the story wasn't over. The ripple had only just begun. And where it would lead, no one knew. But as the girl turned and walked back to her seat, there was a sense that change had been ignited. And it was up to everyone in that room to decide how they would respond. Would the world hear her? Or would it slip back into the same old patterns? And in the quiet that followed, one thing was certain: the question had been asked. And it was now echoing everywhere. Far beyond the walls of that room. The room remained silent. The weight of the girl's words still hanging in the air. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, unsure of what would come next. As the little girl made her way back to her seat, wiping away the last of her tears, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted. But was it enough to make a real difference? Trump's gaze followed her as she walked away. The hesitation in his eyes more profound than anything he had shown before. His mouth opened again. But for a moment, the words faltered. He cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I didn't expect that," he admitted. The words awkward, almost uncomfortable coming from him. There was a strange honesty in his voice now. Something that had been absent in many of his previous public statements. He looked around at the people in the room, at the journalists, the bystanders, and the woman who had spoken up earlier, and for the first time, he seemed to recognize the weight of their eyes upon him. The woman who had been a quiet support for the girl stepped forward once more. "None of us expected it," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "But we needed to hear it. And we need to listen. All of us." Trump's shoulders stiffened slightly, and he looked down at his hands, his mind visibly racing. The room's tension had changed. No longer was it filled with the usual political theatrics, the scripted responses, or the careful positioning. Instead, it was filled with the raw energy of something more genuine. The little girl had ignited something, a spark that had lit a fire of reflection in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. And now, the question loomed: would they continue to listen? Or would they dismiss the moment as just another fleeting encounter? Would they allow this conversation to evolve into something real? Or would it be swept under the rug like so many others before it? As the room waited in silence, Trump's gaze returned to the girl, still sitting quietly at her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was not seeking applause. She was not demanding change. She had simply spoken the truth. And in doing so, had challenged a system that had grown too comfortable in its own arrogance.
I've said a lot of things over the years, Trump began, his voice now quieter, less the sharp edge it had been moments ago. Some of them I'm proud of. And some I regret. The crowd held its breath again. Was this a shift? Was this his attempt at reconciliation? Or just another political maneuver?
I don't know what the future holds. But what that little girl said, she's right. Leaders should listen. Leaders should try to make things better. And maybe I haven't always done that. Maybe I need to do better, he said. His words not as forceful, but not as dismissive either. It was the kind of admission that few, if any, had ever expected from him. The words, though tentative, were real.
For a moment, there was no applause, no loud cheers. But there was something more profound, an air of contemplation. People were starting to understand that this wasn't just about politics. This was about humanity. This was about recognizing the voices that often go unheard and giving space to those who speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The woman who had supported the girl earlier nodded, her face filled with quiet approval. "Thank you for saying that," she said simply. "It means more than you realize." The room seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had hung like a heavy cloud began to dissipate, replaced by a fragile, yet powerful, sense of possibility. It was a turning point, whether it was a lasting change or a fleeting moment in the long arc of history. No one could yet say. But what was clear was that this conversation had sparked something that could not easily be extinguished. And as the cameras clicked and the journalists began to take notes, there was one thing that remained: the question had been asked. The challenge had been given. And now, it was up to all of them, everyone in that room, and perhaps even the world, to decide how they would respond. Would this moment lead to change? Would they continue to listen, learn, and grow? Or would they simply return to the way things were? The story was far from over. But for now, in the quiet after the storm, it seemed that something had begun, a conversation that might, just might, change everything. As the tension in the room began to ease, something remarkable happened. Slowly, the silence gave way to small, cautious murmurs, whispers of recognition, of acknowledgement, and of something that felt almost like hope. It was clear that this moment, this conversation, was unlike any other. For the first time in a long time, the room wasn't filled with the usual political banter, but with an energy that seemed to transcend party lines and past conflicts. The little girl, though young, had done something powerful. She had not only stood up to a former president but had invited everyone present, audience, leaders, and citizens alike, to reconsider what it truly meant to lead, to care, and to listen. Trump sat back in his chair, the weight of the room's gaze on him heavier than before. His face, once brimming with self-assurance, now held a complexity that no one in the room had expected. He wasn't the same person he had been when he had walked in. The facade had cracked. And in its place, there was a man, vulnerable yet trying to make sense of the moment.
I guess I've never really heard it like this, Trump said, breaking the quiet with a sigh that carried the weight of more than just his own thoughts. Maybe I've been too caught up in the noise of it all. The pressure to be right, to always win the argument. I didn't think about how much that might hurt people, especially the ones who just need to feel heard.
The honesty in his voice was raw and unfiltered, something that seemed almost alien to the man who had once prided himself on his strength and dominance. But there it was. A shift. Small but undeniable.
The room felt different now. People were no longer just watching a political spectacle. They were witnessing a moment of real introspection, a moment where even the most powerful could be touched by the simple, powerful truth of a child's words.
The woman who had comforted the little girl stepped forward once again. Her tone gentler now. "It's never too late to change," she said. Her voice steady with compassion. "And sometimes, it takes moments like this, moments when we are forced to listen, to understand where we've gone wrong." Trump nodded, his eyes momentarily distant, as if searching for something, perhaps the right words, or perhaps the courage to take the next step. He glanced over at the little girl, who had returned to her seat, her face a mixture of quiet satisfaction and youthful resilience. She hadn't expected an apology or grand gesture. She had simply wanted him to listen, to understand. And in that, she had already won. For a long time, there was no applause, no cheering, just a profound, reflective silence. The moment felt like the world itself had paused, holding its breath to see what would come next. Finally, Trump stood up from his seat, the weight of the room's attention still heavy on his shoulders. He looked directly at the little girl, his expression earnest. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now. "Thank you for reminding me what real leadership should look like." The room was still. And then, slowly, a few people began to stand, first one, then another. A ripple of applause, hesitant at first, began to grow, spreading through the room like a wave. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was sincere. People weren't applauding because of who he was, they were applauding because, in this moment, he had listened. He had reflected. And in doing so, he had given them a glimpse of the possibility of change. The little girl smiled, her face lighting up with something deeper than joy, something that came from knowing that she had, in her own way, made a difference. As the applause continued, Trump turned and walked toward the exit, his steps slower than they had been earlier, as if the weight of the moment had settled on him in a way that couldn't be shaken off so easily. But there was something different in his posture now, something less rigid, less certain of itself. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't seem like the man who had all the answers. As the room began to empty, people exchanged quiet words with one another, their expressions thoughtful. The little girl, sitting quietly in her seat, had already begun to understand the truth. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or speeches. Sometimes, it comes from the simplest of actions, asking a question, speaking your truth, and daring to listen. The cameras clicked and flashed, capturing the moment for the world to see. But in the hearts of those present, something far more profound had occurred. It wasn't just about politics. It was about humanity. It was about compassion. It was about remembering that, no matter how big or small, every voice mattered. And as the last few stragglers left the room, the little girl stood up, looking out at the world that lay before her. She had done more than ask a question. She had started a conversation that would continue long after the cameras were gone. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.